Welcome to Reader Meet Writer Okra Picks, featuring Carter Sickels with his book, The Prettiest Star. We hope to provide some retail therapy, entertainment, and distraction during this hour. I'm Wanda with the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. And now to today's writer. Carter Sickels is the author of the novels The Prettiest Star and The Evening Hour. He is the recipient of the 2013 Lambda Literary Emerging Writer Award and has been awarded scholarships to Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Sewanee Writers Conference, the VCCA, and the MacDowell Colony. His essays and fiction have appeared in various publications, including Guernica, Bellevue Literary Review, and BuzzFeed. Carter is assistant professor of English at Eastern Kentucky University, where he teaches in the Bluegrass Writers Studio Low-Residency MFA program. Hey, Carter, welcome.
Hi.
We're excited today to hear from you and to hear about your new book, The Prettiest Star.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here, Wanda. And thank
Love
you
having
to Wanda, to Linda Marie, to Nikki, and to Seba. It's just an honor to be here, and for The Prettiest Star to be an Okra pick. I'm very excited about that.
We are too.
And I'm just so grateful for the support of so many independent bookstores. And I think this is now more than ever, we need to support our independent bookstores. They're just so necessary and critical. And I'm just so happy to see all of you, to connect with my readers out there. There's just nothing more kind of meaningful than that, to get the book into readers' hands and for you all to connect to the story in your own way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book, and then I'm going to read a little bit from it as well. So here's the book, Prettiest Star, with this beautiful cover, and it's published by Hub City Press out of Spartanburg, South Carolina. And the novel is set in 1986, and it's about Brian Jackson, a young gay man who has been diagnosed with AIDS and HIV, and he's been living in New York since he was 18. And he's lost his boyfriend and many of his friends to AIDS, and so he decides to return to the small town in Appalachia in Southeast Ohio, where he grew up. And when he returns home, his parents and family insist on keeping his sexuality and his HIV status a secret. And that secrecy and shame really starts to weigh on Brian and kind of tear the family apart as rumors start up in town and the family is harassed. So I think it's a book about shame and silence, but it's also a book about home and the fractures and binds of family and love. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the characters today and creating those characters. But first, I'll give you just a little bit more background on the setting. So it takes place in 1986, and that year is pretty important in the book because it's 1 year after Rock Hudson died of AIDS. And that really changed the way the public kind of viewed AIDS. It was a time that really brought the news of AIDS into homes across America. And at this point, thousands of people had already died of AIDS, the majority of them gay men and drug addicts. And thousands more would die and were HIV positive. But it wasn't until, I think, 1987, that President Reagan actually mentioned AIDS to the public, and that was after 40,000 people had already died. And the country's attitude on the whole was to just turn its back on people with AIDS, from the media, the government, the medical community, churches. Families often turned away their sons or would make them eat out of separate utensils, using separate utensils, or wash their clothes separately, or nurses or aides would leave food trays in the hallways instead of bringing it into the patients. And so on the whole, a lot of people with AIDS and gay men were just viewed as expendable. And so that's kind of the background in the era of the era and the setting. Um, the novel's looking at the AIDS crisis, but it's looking at one family, and it's looking at it through the lens of a small town. I think most of the literature we read or movies we see about the AIDS crisis take place in San Francisco and in New York. And those stories are really important because those were the kind of epicenters of the epidemic, and so many communities were just devastated. But there were also men who returned to the towns where they grew up. Maybe they lost friends, maybe they lost their jobs, or they just wanted to go back home and see their families and to reunite. So I wanted to follow one of these men home and tell a story that I think has been overlooked, which is AIDS in rural areas and queer lives in rural areas. I think both of those are kind of overlooked. And so that was what I was, something that I was looking at as I was writing this book. And so the book follows 3 different characters' points of view. And I've always loved novels that use multiple narrators, from William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, Love Medicine, and all of Louise Erdrich's novels, Michael Cunningham's The Hours. Those all use multiple narrators, and through those different narrators, you learn about a community, about a place, from different angles and different perspectives. And I just love the tension, especially when those perspectives sometimes contradict each other. I think you can get a lot of trouble, and things kind of can get interesting then. So this is Brian's story, but because it's a story of his family, I wanted to step into their shoes as well. So you hear from Brian, and you hear from his mother, Sharon, and you hear from his little sister, Jess. And they each have their own secrets and hopes and dreams and their own kind of story arc and emotional journeys. So I thought what I would do is just give you a little bit of background on each of the characters and read just a short section from their perspectives. So I'm going to start with Jess. So Jess is 14, and she hasn't seen her brother since she was 8 years old. And she doesn't know why he left, and she doesn't really understand why he's come back now, because her parents don't want to tell her what's going on with him. You know, she's constantly being sort of lied to by the adults around her. And that secrecy starts to weigh on her. So she doesn't know exactly what's going on. She doesn't have words for it, but she's very savvy. She's really insightful and smart, and she can often see what the adult characters can't, or articulate what they can't, because they have all their own sort of baggage. So her story is kind of her coming of age, but it's also about facing the lies and secrets of her family. And it asks the question of her, like, will she let go of some of that shame? And how does she grow? You know, will she support her brother? One thing to know about Jess is that she has a real interest in whales, in killer whales. She reads about them all the time. She watches PBS nature specials on them. And the whales start to symbolize a way, well, they sort of transport her from her small town in Appalachia to this kind of mystery and wildness in the world. And so when you read the book, you'll hear her talk about whales quite a bit. So I'll read just a short section, and this is, let me find it here. Oh, I lost for a second. Okay, so this is Jess's first chapter in the book, and this is when her mother is telling her that Brian's coming back. The killer whales are the most misunderstood of whales. To begin with, although everyone calls them whales, they're actually dolphins. For hundreds of years, people believed killer whales were man-eaters. It's not true. They don't attack humans. Killer whales travel in pods and hunt and play and rest together. In the wild, the females can live up to 100 years. A mother's offspring stays with her for life. They mourn their dead. My mother fakes interest. Something is wrong. She hardly ever comes downstairs except to do laundry, and she's not much of a TV watcher. Would you look at that, she says, eyes on the screen. How can that be real? The show has moved on to blue whales, the biggest mammal on Earth. One parts the ocean like a giant submarine. A close-up shows its enormous, battle-scarred body, all the nicks and healed-over cuts and scrapes. Cement-colored barnacles clinging to it like clusters of dead flowers. Bigger than any of the dinosaurs, the man says in his calm voice. Its heart is the size of a Volkswagen Bug. Facts I already know. When I was little, I pored over the pictures and the sea, part of a collection of books from the Life Nature Library my grandmother gave me and my brother one Christmas. We also had Early Man, the mammals, the universe. I saw my first episode of The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau when I was 4 or 5, and after that I was hooked. I want to be a marine biologist, but I live in Ohio. I've never even been to the ocean. I reach into the box of Cheez-Its. You're going to ruin your supper, my mother says. My mother doesn't eat junk food, and she's always on a diet, even though she isn't fat, not like my aunts. I'm not either, but I'm plump. That was what one of my Sunday school teachers said about me. Plump is a horrible word, like chunky. My mother is pretty, everyone thinks so. She looks like a movie star in one of those old black and white movies that run on Saturday afternoons when nothing else is on except baseball or kung fu. Jess, honey, there's something I need to tell you. This was what she sounded like the day she told me about sex. When a man and woman love each other, when they're married, she started, using the same teacher voice she's using now, and I wanted to die, hearing my mother say the word penis. What? I ask. The orange crackers are the size of postage stamps, and I drop them one at a time in my mouth, splintering and crushing them with my teeth. The corners of her lips lift, but they are pressed too tightly to turn into a smile. She's wearing her work clothes, iron tan slacks, a navy blouse with a scooped neck, and her makeup is soft around the eyes. Unlike my grandmother, my mother believes makeup shouldn't call attention to itself, but only be used to enhance natural beauty. When I turned 14, she told me I was allowed to wear blush and lip gloss, but I hardly ever put it on. I don't look right in it, not like the girls at school. It's about your brother, she says. Brian, I ask stupidly, as if I have more than one. He's coming home. My mother's eyes, a light brown like watered down Pepsi, the same color as mine, glisten, but no tears fall. She tells me he'll be here this weekend. To visit, I ask, to stay? A little sigh escapes. Her shoulders sink. We don't know yet. I have a million questions, and she says we'll talk more during supper after my father gets home. She needs to check on the meatloaf, she says. She kisses me on the forehead, and the fruity, soapy scent of Charlie, her work perfume, lingers after she's gone. The invisible man on TV and his trusting, all-knowing voice explains they still don't know where the blue whales go to breed, somewhere deep in the ocean that scientists can't pinpoint. As a marine biologist, I'll work for National Geographic or NOVA. I'll go out on a boat in the middle of the ocean, no sign of land for miles. Blue, more blue. Brian and I used to watch Jacques Cousteau together. One time he brought home the record, Songs of the Humpback Whale, and we listened to it stretched out on our backs across the carpet, pretending we were floating in the sea. So that is the first time you hear from Jess. And then I'm going to read from a couple of the other characters, from the other two characters' perspectives. So the other character is Brian's mother, Sharon. And when I first started writing the novel, the first scene I wrote was from Jess's point of view when Brian came back and walked through the door. And so that first few months I was writing from Jess's and Brian's perspectives, and then I wrote a chapter from Sharon's perspective. And that's when the novel really opened up for me, because there was just so much potential with her character for complexity and tension. And she gave me another angle into the story. And sometimes that was a complicated and troubling angle. But for me, Sharon is kind of the voice of restraint and denial. She presents herself as holding the family and herself together, kind of keeping her house in order. But she is grief and guilt-ridden, and she's always on the verge of kind of falling apart. She loves her son, but she's so worried about what her neighbors will say and worried about what church members will think that that gets in the way of her really fully taking her son in. And she's grown up and lived in this community where the homophobia is just a part of the ideology, and she doesn't know, or she's afraid to question that. So I wanted to understand her, and I tried to write her from this place of real tenderness and empathy, but also not to let her off the hook. And so one of the questions that I ask is, will Sharon examine her own beliefs and question herself and what she's been taught, and how does she, or will she evolve over the course of the novel? And so I'm going to read a scene from her perspective that's a little later. Brian's been home about 3 weeks at this point, maybe a month. And it's a scene between Sharon and her husband, Travis. And Travis cannot accept his son's illness or sexuality, and he doesn't want to talk about it. And his way of dealing with anything uncomfortable is to just not deal with it, to kind of retreat or turn away. So it's just a short scene between the two of them. I'm not outside for more than a few minutes when I hear the door. Afraid it's Jess, I stub out the cigarette. I don't want her to know I've started smoking. But it's Travis. Still in his work clothes, smelling of cheap beer and sweat. He squints, sounds hurt. You smoking? Since when? I don't remember. A month or two ago. I relight the cigarette, and Travis lifts his eyebrows and makes a s sound, surprised. He doesn't look good. Heavy eyes, the skin around them pinched, gray-black stubble, thick mustache. He needs to shave. And I don't know what I'm sorry for exactly, but I am. We have not made love since Brian's been home. I made you a plate, I say. You want me to heat it up in the microwave? No, I had a burger at the refuge. I can't force them to spend time together. I've mentioned to Travis maybe they should go to a ball game, but he just says, we'll see. I've seen how Brian looks at him, the longing in his eyes. The sun flattens into a thin red line. Next door, the Pentecostal girls' prairie dresses hang limply from the clothesline, like drabber versions of themselves. Travis comes closer, doesn't touch me. The evening light spreads cloud-like across the yard, turning trees into tall, still shadows. I feel his body tense next to mine, the hushed silence, the weight of what he wants to say. Today at work, Wayne asked me what's wrong with Brian. Travis pauses, wanted to know what's really wrong with him. He can't stand the thought of disappointing his big brother, can't stand the thought of embarrassing or disgracing the family. Did you tell him, I ask? Are you kidding? Do you know what he'd do, what he'd say? I remember not very long ago, Wayne said people with AIDS should be sent to a faraway island. And every one of us, me, my husband, my nephews, and nieces, we all agreed wholeheartedly. Protect the good from the bad, the normal from the abnormal, the innocent from the infected. They know something is going on, Travis. Maybe we should tell them. He has not said the word yet. Maybe he never will. And I'll continue to go along with the charade, because what else can I do? My son is sick. My son is dying. No, no, no. If we don't say these words, they will not be true. But I can't keep hiding. Not like this. No, Travis says with finality. We can't tell them. Nobody can know. So that's just one scene again with Sharon. And finally, I'll finish with a scene from Brian's point of view. And Brian is the main character. He's really the anchor of the novel. He's 24 years old. You know, he's lost his boyfriend and countless friends to AIDS. And he feels abandoned. But he has a complicated relationship with home, which I think a lot of queer people do. He also loves his family and has a lot of fond memories of growing up there and feels very connected to the rural parts of it as well. When he was younger, he was kind of a baseball star. He was very popular, but he often felt apart from everyone else. And when he was younger, he discovered the music of David Bowie, and that really spoke to him, which is where the title of the book came from. That's a David Bowie song title. And David Bowie was just this expression of freedom and sexuality and gender that he had never seen before. And so it kind of becomes a symbol of Brian's, of freedom for Brian. And he kind of dreams of this other life, and dreams of leaving. So when he's 18, he moves to New York, and he finds community and friendship and love. And he meets a lot of artists in New York. And again, this is the early 80s. There's a big downtown art scene in New York. And he kind of becomes a sort of amateur video artist. Video cameras were also becoming very popular in the mid 80s. So he brings his video camera home with him, and he records himself using his camera. He records himself from his bedroom in his parents' basement. And these are how his chapters are framed. They're kind of these video diaries where he's talking directly to the viewer or to the reader. It was really a way for me to also give him control over his own story, and to kind of document a queer person's life and experience, and to sort of have a record of that. So I'm going to read one of those passages from Brian's point of view. And this is, I guess he's been home about 2 months now. And it's a scene with his grandmother. And I haven't talked about her yet, but Letty is the grandmother, and she's kind of the matriarch of the family. And she's really the one family member who never expresses any embarrassment about Brian or shame. And she defends him and protects him. So this is a scene with his grandmother. June 27th, 1986. Today, I was watching TV with my grandmother, and Tammy Faye Baker was on, singing about Jesus, and Mama looked at me. Honey, even if you don't go to church, God will still listen to your prayers, she says. Good Lord, was she telling me to get right with God? Does she worry I'm headed to hell? Tammy Faye doesn't seem to believe in a punishing kind of God, and I don't think my grandmother does either. As Tammy Faye blinked her mascara-thick lashes, I was reminded of drag queens I knew in New York. I wouldn't mind going to church with Tammy Faye, I said, especially if she'd let me do her makeup. Mamaw giggled. Big alligator tears started to run down Tammy Faye's glittery pink cheeks. Oh, there she goes. Anything can set her off, Mamaw said. When I was little on Avon nights, we'd sit at the table and Mamaw would make lists of what she sold and what she needed to reorder. I'd help organize everything, lining up mascara wands, tubes of lipstick, flat pressed squares of eyeshadow, moisturizer that smelled like flowers, eye cream. I loved the dark green bottles of perfume, the elegant gold cases of rouge. My grandmother didn't care if my hands fluttered. She asked my opinions and trusted my taste. I think Mamaw would love to see a drag queen. Sometimes I'd help friends with their makeup, but I only did drag a couple of times myself. I never performed or went out in public, didn't have the nerve or courage. But still, when I sat in front of a mirror and brushed on blush and eyeshadow, glued on eyelashes, I felt a wild shock of delight. Boys came to me because I had the right touch. A few of them are dead, others sick, others infected. They were thrilled to be wearing makeup and sparkling gowns and wigs, to be free from their father's disappointment and shame. They were so beautiful. And I'll stop there. And so the novel follows these three characters and focuses on their stories, but there are many other characters who show up. And I think through all of them, you get a better sense of the town and the extended family, and also Brian's chosen queer family, as well as the family unit that the novel focuses on.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for reading for us, Carter. It's now time for questions, y'all. It's important you stay muted so we can all hear Carter's answers. In the chat option, please begin all questions with a capital Q. And if you'd like, name your local store and we'll mention them as well when we ask your question. Linda Marie will be asking all the questions today that you put in the chat. Linda Marie, do we have a question for Carter?
We do. The first question from a viewer, they're curious about your decision to not write a lot from Travis's point of view. And they wondered if his voice was too hard to write from, or did his absence have a thematic purpose?
That's a great question. And yeah, I thought about that a lot. And when I first started working on the novel, when I begin, I don't start with an outline or anything. I'm just sort of writing and trying to figure out who the characters are. So I did write some sections from Travis's point of view, but in the end, I think it was both. I think he was a difficult character to write from his perspective, but I also I think there have been too many stories about a character coming back, a gay character coming back, and who doesn't have a voice. So I wanted to make sure Brian for sure had a voice in this, and then I guess I was just more interested in sort of his sister and mother's perspective, and I want to show the father's perspective, but also his silence and that kind of masculinity, I think, works as this tension in the novel as a sort of weight over. I mean, we see his pain and his guilt, Travis's. But I didn't think he would be able to articulate that, especially in a first person voice. Honestly. And so, yeah, I felt like he hadn't quite earned that space yet in the novel, if that makes sense, to get his own point of view there.
Is there a character in the novel that surprised you as you developed them? They maybe grew into more of a presence than you'd originally planned?
Yeah, there's a few minor characters who grew, and I think one of my favorite characters is Andrew. And Andrew is a gay man who lives in the town nearby, and Brian meets him when he goes to the mall with his mama. And Andrew's a little bit older than Brian, but he's never left. So he stayed in this community and never left, and he works at Sears. That's how they meet. And he's just this sort of small town gay guy who in some ways is closeted, but in other ways he's very kind of flamboyant and effeminate. And I loved once he sort of showed up to me, and I thought, oh, he has to come back into this novel. And then he ends up being a part of this family that Brian kind of creates, which is members of his own blood family and then his queer family. And so he was sort of a fun character to write, but also he shows up and kind of leads the family in taking care of Brian as he declines, as his physical health declines and he gets sicker. I also thought he was kind of an interesting character because he lives with his mother and in a trailer kind of on the outskirts, and his mother is quite supportive of him. And so I think that, we often see these really sort of simple binaries of, rural homophobic and urban as more progressive. And so I thought she's a very minor character, Janie, but she adds kind of another interesting element because she's so loving of her son, whereas Brian's own family can't fully accept him. But that's a great question. Thanks.
Can you speak a little more about your decision to set the narrative in Appalachian Ohio? And this is from a fan of Brazos bookstore in Houston.
Oh, great. Yeah, I grew up in Ohio in a small rural town. I grew up a little closer to central Ohio, but all my family and my grandparents are all from southeast Ohio. That's where I've spent a lot of time growing up, and I went to college there as well. And I'm really interested in Appalachia and rural spaces, especially when I include the gay characters or queer themes, because again, I think it's sort of an overlooked story. I think that Appalachia is often sort of overlooked. It's a sort of isolated area. It's so beautiful, but but so isolated. And it kind of gets overlooked, I think, a lot in Southern literature. And then I think within that, Ohio is a part of Appalachia, but it gets kind of really dismissed as a part of Appalachian literature. So to me, it's just like very small corner of Ohio that's very different than the rest of the state. It looks different. It's more, it's hills. It's not flat. It's kind of, there are no mountains, of course, like Appalachia, but there's a lot of similarities to West Virginia, to Eastern Kentucky. So part of it was just from growing up near that area and then wanting to kind of highlight that in literature.
We have some questions about your writing process.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you don't use an outline. Do you use a storyboard?
I don't really do anything sort of that formal. I start with just my character ideas, and I use notebooks. I have about 4 notebooks from this novel that I'm not composing in the notebooks, but I use the notebooks to write down my ideas, to keep lists of maybe songs that were popular in 1986, to write questions I have about the characters or about the plot, to do some characters profiles and sketches. So I use all of those. And then, as I get further into the novel and it starts to take more of a shape, then at some point I will do sort of my version of the outline, which is I will start kind of writing, what's happened in each chapter, like the major events, and sort of looking at how I can put those together and how the art can build and kind of amplify that tension.
Another question is, the medical details of your book seem really well researched. Can you talk about your research? And this person is also noting the relevance of what's happening today.
Yeah. I mean, I spent about 5 years on the novel, and throughout that I was conducting quite a bit of research. So I read articles and books, and the band Played On was a really important book for me to use. There's an incredible book called My Own Country by Abraham Varghese about his time in East Tennessee as an infectious disease doctor, and what that looked like when AIDS showed up. And I think it was around 85, 86 in Appalachia. So a huge stack of books. I watch a lot of documentaries from the time as well. And I was really conscious of wanting to get it right. And I wanted the decline, the physical decline. I wanted readers to have to look at that and see what that looked like for Brian to essentially be dying. But at the same time, I wanted to be kind of careful with that too, and not sensationalize what that looked like for a queer man to be dying of AIDS. But thank you. I did quite a bit of research for it. And there's much to say, and I still don't know. I'm still sort of figuring out myself, as we all are. But certainly when I was writing this novel, I had no idea we would be in a global pandemic. And the diseases are very, very different. The responses to them are very, very different. But I think this book is now resonating in ways that wasn't necessarily expecting. And one thing I keep going back to is, I think a question the book is asking, and a question I think we are going to be asking ourselves, is like, what kind of world do we want to be? What kind of society do we want to be? And how do we take care of each other? And how do we show compassion and love, and try to keep each other healthy and alive? So thank you.
Another viewer asks, how does a writer living in Appalachia or rural areas find a writing community or create one to support one's writing?
It's a good question. There is a rich writing community here in Appalachia and in Kentucky. I mean, I can name many Kentucky authors: Silas House, Robert Guy, Crystal Wilkinson, Rebecca Gale Howe, so many. And what's been, because I lived in Portland, Oregon for many years. And I also lived in New York. And what I love about the writing community here is that it's so accessible, that we all show up. I mean, not right now, except if it's virtually, but we all showed up to each other's readings, events, we're all reading each other's work. And I think there is just such a rich Appalachian writing community. And I think if you are asking because you're living in a sort of small town or rural place, I think just trying to reach out through Facebook groups, Instagram, social media can be a great tool in that way to connect us and to get into a writing group that, maybe you're not meeting face to face, which none of us should be doing right now anyways. So have a virtual writing group, I think, would be fantastic. And I also just want to give a shout out to that Heinemann Settlement School and the Appalachian Writers Conference, which happens in Kentucky every summer. And it's just an incredible resource and community of writers. And I encourage you to apply for that. This summer it will be moved online, but I think I'm assuming next summer we will be back in the physical space.
Linda Marie, we have time for one more question.
Okay. A number of writers in the series have mentioned that with the pandemic, they've been too distracted to write. And how is that going for you?
Yeah, good question. I've been really focused on, since my book just launched yesterday, I've been quite focused on just kind of on that. But I have been writing a little bit, mostly editing pieces that I've already written. So essays and short stories, just kind of editing that right now. It's been hard to focus with sustained chunks of time on something new. But, I think we all need to be gentle with ourselves. And I'm also using what would normally be my writing time to read. I'm doing a lot of reading right now. And I think, the reading is just as valuable for writers. So that's what I've been doing, and cooking too.
Thank you, Carter. And thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. And if you enjoyed it as much as I did, let your bookstore know and order the book from them. We hope to be scheduling more authors, so please be in touch with your bookstore with any suggestions or ideas for how this could have been better for you. And order The Prettiest Star from them. Thanks so much, Carter. Linda Marie and Nikki, thank you as well. This is Wanda signing off.
Thank you.
Bye.